Hi, welcome to Flow Dive. Today we're talking with artist, musician, and printmaker Heather Moulder, and we're just going to get right into it. We're going to be talking about flow, creative process, and probably lots of other things in between. So Heather, thank you for joining me. I would like for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're currently working on, what you would label yourself as.
Yeah, I feel like description is accurate. I would say designer, printmaker, musician. And for the past, I guess like career wise, for the past nearly 13 years, I worked at Het Show Print, which is a 145-year-old continuously operating letterpress shop. So I did a lot of printmaking for different artists and events all across the world. And recently, I worked my last regularly scheduled day there. So this summer, I've been doing a ton of travel. I kind of like took the hiatus that I never had working continuously for so long. So I've been getting a lot of input traveling to these other places. That's kind of what fuels me. And in the fall, I'll be teaching a college class for the first time. And so I'm like mentally preparing for that. But also like working on doing my own poster commissions here at my home studio. And I also work at my local art center in my hometown. So we put on a big craft fair in September. So almost more so than working on my own art, I've been like organizing other artists and getting them ready to sell their work. But it's been really helpful for me to just kind of learn like how promotion works, how organization works, how grants work. So I've been getting input from like all arenas right now, just getting ready for this fall.
Wow, that's a lot. That's
It
awesome.
is.
Um, Background wise, our listeners, it would be helpful for them to know that we met when you were quite young. I was pretty young too. But can you tell me a little bit about that environment where we met and maybe if it inspired you or like set you on a path in your creative life? Because you were already creative before we met, of course. But was there something that was catalyzing in that environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So Anna and I met at the Southern Girls Rock and Roll Camp, which was a week-long day camp here, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And so as a camper, you learn an instrument, you play in bands, and you also get like a supplementary class in some music-related industry. So in my case, I took gig poster printing, which at the time I like had no idea that was an option for a career, and it definitely planted the seed of like this is what I could be when I grow up. And I think it's also just important to point out like I grew up in a pretty rural area, Woodbury, Tennessee. There's I think like 2,500 people in Woodbury. Um, and so just like exposure to these arenas was really great for me to see because I just had no idea that was a career option. And so going to camp, I got to like see what poster printing was like. I got to perform songs that I wrote for the first time. And it also just connected me to such a great network of volunteers and people in the local music community that I was only a camper for a year, but I continued to volunteer for probably nearly a decade after that. And those connections and just that exposure were pretty huge for me, I would say, in my trajectory.
Cool. Yeah, for me, it parallels what you're doing right now in helping the art center. So you felt that support in that environment and now you're like giving it, and you have been giving it, I know, for several years. And it just also highlights the importance of community, and especially in the arts community. And I do understand growing up in a rural area, and that was something that I wanted to talk about as well in influences. Um, when you're in an isolated area in the way of like exposure, possibly like no internet sometimes, and things like that growing up, you really have to find your inspiration in many, many places. And sometimes it's the people that you sit around and talk with. Sometimes it's the music that those people are just playing at their house or on their porch, or people will put together smaller get-togethers. But in your hometown, there's an art center, which is really amazing and has won many awards, which you've been part of as well, in those creations. And it just goes to show that it may not be overnight, that these things sort of arise. And your career has had many seeds, and now I hope that many of them are just blooming at this point. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh yeah, I think like the importance of like keeping it moving. Like the art center was one of the first places that gave me any paid design or print jobs, and I feel so many parallels to when I was first starting out and had those opportunities and like trying to pass those on. Like anytime we get a little bit of grant funding, for me, it's like a great joy to be like, where can I spread this around and who can I pull in with this? And I think it is a really great gift to our community, and definitely easy to take for granted, but there are just so many talented people that volunteer there, that cross paths there, and I'm really happy to be a part of that community.
So when you were a kid, did you go to the art center and watch plays? And I've seen you in plays before, perform in plays, but what was it like in your hometown having that center, that community? What was it like for you?
It was really just great to have an option for something to do, because like, you probably have to drive at least 20-30 minutes. For my house, definitely at least half an hour to get to a movie theater or like a big shopping center. And it was really like, unless you're into sports, there's plenty of sports avenues here. And I definitely grew up playing music at some of the horse shows in town. But other than that, like the art center was a great outlet for a place to see theater, a place to go to an art gallery. For a minute, one of our galleries was actually a cultural museum. So I got exposure to all these traditions that you may not learn in school, like about basket making and moonshining and like what those roots in our community are. But it's definitely like a huge part of the history here in Cannon County.
That's awesome. There's something to being physically present and watching someone who has a trade or a skill that is also disappearing. There's a magic to it to where it's bittersweet because you like to watch it and you know that that person has given a lot of time to become a master of their craft, or maybe they're just learning, but they're so interested and it ties them to the location, and that's part of their identity. And this is something that I wrote about in grad school, of how these identities form. And what I also wanted to talk about in your musical career is what the influences that you feel like have been the strongest growing up in rural Tennessee, but also being Filipina. So can you tell me about those two worlds colliding and what it was like growing up? You're still growing. But yeah, tell me a little bit about that.
I would say that being based here in Middle Tennessee, and as I started working with Hatch, I ended up moving to Nashville. So I was kind of between like rural and like the big city, which Nashville was like a huge city for me at the time. I remember when I first started working there, I was not concerned about the job. I felt really good about doing the work, but I was like terrified. Like I had to get on the interstate. I had to like park downtown. And to me, like when you have one stoplight, like that was really intimidating to me. But kind of bouncing between here and there, like of course, like a lot of the music I was exposed to, like we have Uncle Dave Macon days here. We have like old time fiddling festivals around this area, and I'm a piano player, so I can't really like participate on a super high level in a lot of those like picking circles, but I still loved like the community aspect and singing with the group and strumming chords along with them. And at the art center, I played a lot of musical theater. So I was like reading written music and performing like a very prescribed score. And then going to Nashville, I started sitting in with a lot of country, like classic country groups, and learning the Nashville number system, and like kind of learning like how to be like a gig player and be able to jump in and be more intuitive. and played more by ear. And I guess on the other side of things, so my mom is from the Philippines, Las Piñas, which is pretty much in the city outside of Manila there. My dad is from here in Woodbury, so like rural Tennessee. And of course, like most Filipinos that come to America, you kind of just like fall into American tradition. You really try to assimilate and be part of the culture, work on your English. And I feel like her way of really pulling me into that culture was we did a lot of folk dances. And so we had like a little dance troupe of all the other Phil-Am kids, and we would learn a lot of the traditional Filipino dances. And so there was some of that music in those soundtracks and in that dance that we were exposed to. And I think just being in that community and like flipping back and forth between, you know, the typical crowd of people I'd see in Woodbury and then the crowd of people I'd see at these international festivals, it just offered really good perspective. You know, just taking notes of changes in the environment, changes in demeanor, and how people interact and want to dance in these situations. But it definitely like helped me look at everything with fresh eyes on both sides, really.
I feel that very deeply having grown up. So I'm half Mexican and half from the South, like my dad. Um, so when we kind of are segmented, I'll say, when we grow up in these different environments, we do tend to, I have observed a lot of how people interact, but also I like to cross pollinate the different types of music. So I also grew up going to like barns and things where there was picking and grinning, and like there was just a different way between sort of bluegrass and honky tonk, and you just never knew what you were going to hear, and even like gospel as well. So listening to the humanity in the voices of Southern music, I really enjoy it because it's not pitch perfect. It's very much about the sentiment that you want to communicate and express. And that's something that, you know, in our modern world, when we kind of see it, the technologies developing, and that part as a musician and an artist is a little bit like, oh my gosh, like what is happening? The humanity is feels like it's being pulled away. But at the same time, when you practice as an artist in any form, you know that you are irreplaceable. There's nothing that could replicate what you do. And your case in particular, you are one of the few people that know how to operate certain machines in the country, correct?
There is some specialized machinery there for sure.
Yeah. So, you know, you have the perspective of these old and new worlds as well. And I think that we're in a general bracket of age group where it's really an honor to have grown up without the internet and in a rural area, and then to see all the technology change and happen. But tell me about your music that you integrated your mother's side of the family. Like, how did that happen for you? What was the impetus for you, where you were like, I think I want to marry these two things together through music?
Yeah, I would say I'm still on the journey. I don't think I've like found the perfect recipe yet. But I would say like one major development in my learning over the past couple of years is so as I was growing up and doing a lot of the cultural dances, a lot of the music was based on very Spanish influenced music. They call that like string group or rondalia when they have like some of like the rhythms, the melodies, like very Spanish influence when you hear it. And I was really curious because a couple of the dances we did were based on more indigenous forms of Filipino music, which is very like gong and rhythm based. And so there's this set of tungongs called the kulintang that I was just totally fascinated with. And I told mom, like, I want to learn about this Filipino instrument. And last year, she surprised me and bought me a set. She had a friend of a friend that drove out. There's not many people making this instrument. They're like forged and cast, and it's not easy to pack in a suitcase. And so she bought me this instrument. But then I felt this responsibility to like learn it correctly, which being here, I did not have a lot of access to someone who could teach me that music. And so I linked up with a group called House of Gongs. I think at the time when I first started talking to them, they were based in San Francisco. The couple, Lydia and Ron, that run it, are now in Hawaii. But their whole mission with House of Gongs is to just kind of connect primarily like Filipino Americans that want to learn more about Indigenous music with like true, members of that lineage. And so they will bring artists from the Philippines working in that tradition here to teach us firsthand. And the first time I went to one of their events, it was they have an event called Gongsters Paradise, which is all people creating music based on this set of gongs. And I think one thing that blew my mind is they had like textbook, very traditional examples of this music, going to like new bands that are integrating it into hip hop, that are integrating it into electronic music. But they all have that reverence and that understanding of the history of the music and where it came from. And I remember when I flew to the West Coast to San Francisco to attend that event, the first thing I thought when I got off the plane, because like in the bathroom, like your second translation is in Tagalog, it's not Spanish. Like here, second language is pretty rare anyways, but for it to not even be weird to be Filipino, like I felt like the whitest person in the room in San Francisco, which is like a totally different feeling than here. And I just realized like I had so much to learn. Even when I grew up doing these dances and we were kind of like, sharing our culture in this area, a lot of times we were learning from videos on the internet. We didn't have a ton of firsthand sources. And so when I started taking workshops with House of Gongs, it was like firsthand people working in the tradition and learning a lot of history and cultural information to kind of supplement just learning the moves of the dances and the music. And so I feel like I've just kind of started this whole journey of, I really want to understand this music correctly before I propagate it and work it into my own thing. So I'm in the learning phase with it. This long answer to say that I am still figuring things out, learning to play these instruments, but it's really kind of started like a whole new mental approach of like, how can I, make this part of my practice. And I feel like, on one hand, like, yes, I feel very removed when I dive straight into this community, but also like, I feel like it is my responsibility of like, how do I honor the music from where I grew up and like bring this in, because like, there's no better example of my own self than finding out how these musics integrate. And there totally is parallels, like Appalachian music, those modes, those ways of just singing from the heart, like discarding like some of the Western ideas of like this pitch must be perfect. There's a ton of parallels that I saw there. And so I think there can be some natural connections. I'm just figuring out where they are.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, there was a word that you used, and we're going to get to flow since this is called Flow Dive.
Oh, yeah.
But I wanted to set up this like container for people to understand. We have similarities, being half something else. There's always this curiosity and this dance between fitting in and being different and wanting to fit in and being different. But it's really beautiful once you can kind of relax into it. There's less of like, I'll never be good enough or Mexican enough in my case, or I'm not fluent in Spanish yet. It's a lifelong journey for me with that. But when you can relax into it and understand what does, you use the word reverence, what does reverence look like for me in what I'm doing every day as an artist, a musician, and as a person? And so that's really a beautiful word for it. I think it's perfect. So in flow, there's 4 stages to the flow cycle. There's struggle, release, flow, and recovery. And you recently spent some time in recovery, but in the recovery, you were still like learning printmaking and, exploring the world, right? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I feel like even when I'm the most stressed, like my method of getting more input and getting excited again is to like take in these new experiences, like traveling, even if it's like the most mundane day trip to something, just shaking up my routine really helps me like get back on track. Um, and I always find, and I don't know, I think this is a common thing with artists, is like when you're working on a project, you're always thinking about the next project. You're already ready to take on a new thing. And I think one of the reasons, like for me anyways, is that probably the most exciting part of the process is at the beginning when you have like a million different options, because it truly can be anything. You have this outlook, you have this brand new project, and it could really go in any direction. And the hardest part, and I think this is like taking us into like the flow progression, is picking your path and sticking with it. And if anybody knows, I mean, like the last like 10% is always the hardest to check off, but it's like, you have this like wide open, multiple possibilities part of the process. And then once you kind of like choose your path and get really into it, like that's the part where I feel like, I really tend to be in flow, is like when you lose time, you have the focus, you have the plan already chosen. Getting to that plan or getting to that, roadmap is a little tough. And then like you flow until that last 10% when you have to really seal the deal and complete the thing. And usually, if I do feel stuck, like just getting new input from a new place or hanging out with new people helps me to like disrupt that part of the process where you get in your head and get option overload.
This is really great to talk about because there are lots of artists who feel paralyzed in that first stage, the struggle. I like to call it the setup phase, because you're setting yourself up for whatever you're about to do. And there's an impatience sometimes when you just want to know what the plan is. But the ironic part is that you have to go through the sorting and the reasoning and the experimentation. I have an experimentation phase where if I'm working with something new, I have to experiment with it because I want to see what are some of the avenues I could use, a new medium, or if the instrument calls for it. Or lyrically, when I write lyrics, oh, I haven't done that before. Could I do it? Of course I can. Anything is possible. But it's almost like convincing yourself that you are going to create the plan and then you're going to execute it. So Patch, you had a lot of practice in the project management. Do you think that really helped you understand your own flow like better?
Oh yeah, like as you're describing this whole process, I'm just thinking, Hatch is such a production heavy environment that it would sometimes feel like you're on a game show. It's like you have this timer, you must design this poster, and like you have to finish the poster by the show. And to me, I really enjoyed that. Like it wears on you if you're like consistently having to design a poster really fast, but I really enjoyed the challenge of, you have this much time. How can I represent this artist? Make a nice looking product, but also get it done within this time frame. And so I think it gave me a lot of practice in coming up with like a nice product on a deadline. And I feel like most artists, we need a deadline. If we don't have it, you could work forever on a project. And I feel like I really thrive when I have a bunch, like when I'm getting a lot of stuff checked off the list and having those deadlines to complete those projects. And I don't know. I have a lot of fun, like trying to see if I can do it within those limits. And you can certainly go too far. And there's a point where you realize, like, oh, my quality may be suffering, or this person is not getting as thoughtful of a project as they could be getting, and that's when I have to like step back and reevaluate. But for the most part, I would say working at Hatch was one of my best trainings in, getting it done, sealing the deal, and like making something within constraints.
Awesome. So in the flow cycle, we have struggle, release, flow, and recovery. So the other thing about taking these paths, if you hadn't gone down the path with Hatch, you wouldn't have this knowledge of like how to actually produce, like on deadlines and with your creativity, right? Like you said, if we want to, we can work forever on it and it will never be done, right? So now you have your own studio, which you're in right now. Tell me about that decision, like the transition, because a lot of artists think, the internet makes us think that things just happen overnight, and in reality, it's like 5-10 years to where you get to a point where you decide to jump.
Yeah, so I had no press at first. I rescued a press out of a basement that was totally rusty, unusable, and that was my pandemic project, was like de-rusting everything. My friend Corey helped me figure out how the mechanics work so we could actually put it back together again and make it run. And so like step one, I had like a press, but then to run a print shop, like you probably need some type, which is also hard to find. Letterpress stuff, you can't just go to the letterpress store and buy new type. And so it's very much a collection and asking people in the community, do you have this? Do you have this weird thing that most print shops would just toss anyway? So I had to get type. I had to get a paper cutter. I was trying to get the bare minimum of having things in a working state. And I mean, I moved an hour outside of Nashville back to my hometown to be able to afford to have a space like this. And there's a lot of converting, a lot of working in like non-ideal spaces. And it's continuously like, this is still like a half tidied up garage. I'm still like figuring out on how I make, my space the easiest to access. But it's definitely over time. And kind of the same idea with the deadline is I kept on signing up for things that would force me to get something done. So I would take on a poster job, not knowing like, do I even have the materials to physically print this? Or I would sign up to teach a virtual class during the pandemic, knowing that like I set the camera up just where you could see my press in the background because everywhere else in the garage was chaos. And I just kept doing stuff like that. And I'm continuing to do stuff like that. It's just like sign up for something and like figure out the path on the way. And it gets better. I mean, it all snowballs the more you do it. And I think probably one misconception, like when you have a home studio, you would think like, I'm just in here all the time making art. And it's totally not the case. I mean, I still operate on the deadline system. I'll sign up for an art show and that will give me an impetus to like wrap up a piece, because you could fiddle around in here endlessly. And sometimes I'll come in and just print for no reason. But a lot of times I'm printing because I signed up to make a poster, or I signed up to deliver a piece to a gallery. And I think you really have to have discipline. Some people are really great about like daily making of things. I find that like managing artists at the art center and planning for teaching, I am not able to make daily. So I really have to plan out my times that I'm able to print. And am I printing for fun, or am I printing for a client? And how can I make this still fulfilling in all arenas?
The way that you describe your journey, right, in this creating your own business and having your own press in your own working area is very much in the line of flow, because there's a challenge skills balance. So every time you're challenged, you're going to be reaching, but you have also the consistency of just showing up, which develops the skill. So that's where flow lives. It's in this perfect like upward motion, but really people think that it's like one straight line, but it's really just like a bunch of ups and downs until you have the consistency and the feedback for the skill. So when you got your press, you had to have many, many, many failures to get the feedback to be like, oh, that's not how I do it.
Yeah.
And what I think a lot of people skip over is that process. Like, oh, it's just somehow I'm just going to be great at it. Without the consistency and repetition and the feedback to say, oh, that's how you do it. Like the 100th time, I finally got it.
Yes. Yeah, when I started working at my home studio versus at Hatch, which it is a well-oiled machine. There's like a flow. I got everyone on staff there. They know exactly how to turn out a poster there in the process of steps. When I came here, I mean, it was like back to square one. It's like, how can I make this happen with my like limited resources and I have unlimited options on how I can change that workflow to make it work better for me here. And so there's a lot of like reapproaching, trial and error for sure, getting to figuring out how the best way for me to make posters in this like tiny garage shop.
So let's talk about also the overall flow of your life, because flow inside of art, it feels a certain way. So let's describe. I'll ask you, how does that feel for you when you're in flow? What does it feel like for you?
I mean, I think it's that stereotypical, like you get lost in the work, you lose track of time. And I was really thinking on this because, like, when I say those things, it's like, well, are we in flow when we scroll social media? Because we also are like not thinking about that and like what makes that different from our artistic flow. But I feel like the difference is I'm actually like making progress as I'm making things. Like there is like something tangible happening in that process. And I think a lot of times unconsciously too, like I'm learning and processing things. And I think just that element of you don't even realize you're there in that time is when I feel the best, because you come out the other end and you have this idea or you have like this, I took a sign painting class and a lot of like one big part of that practice is just like drawing strokes. And it's almost meditative to make like those parallel lines. And I truly like made pages of these parallel lines. And you come out the other side and realize like I've spent 3 hours doing this, but I have this skill at the end that I didn't have. And I think that might be the difference. Like there's an almost flow-like state doing other mindless tasks, but I do think you gain something from an artistic flow practice.
So this is perfect. What you described, I haven't actually articulated yet, I don't think. So when you come out of flow and let's say you have been 3 hours making one stroke, right? The skill is developed through repetition and feedback in many ways, whether that's your eyesight, your hand, like connecting. Oh, when I hold it this very particular way, I'm going to get that stroke. And I know this because I've actually done it. I haven't watched someone else do it. I haven't visualized it in my head. I'm actually doing it. And when you come out, okay, let's stay inside first. When you're inside of flow, there's a part of your brain that contains or is where time is perceived, and that part of your brain is less active. It's transhypofrontality or something like this. So the other thing is the self-critic goes away. So when you're making those lines or you're working directly with your medium, whether it's in an environment that you choose or somewhere else, there's an element of the self that goes away, because the most important thing is the thing that you're doing. It's not, what will this make me, will this win me an award, right? You can't be thinking about those things. You're so focused on the skill, right? So when you come out of it, though, it's a knowing that you have the skill. And in that way, it changes your identity. That, I think, is what you mean by progress. Is that correct?
Yeah, whenever you're saying like, your element of self is removed, it's like, I mean, even when you think about water, like there's no obstacles there whenever it's flowing. And I do think that, like, I was talking about that part in the design process, like the plan's already picked. So even though if I am making decisions as I draw or illustrate something, I would still feel like I'm in flow because I'm not deciding what I'm going to do. Like I know the assignment, and then I get lost in the fun part in the middle where I'm just executing the part that is fun to me, which is the actual, designing and illustrating of the project. But yeah, having like, I feel like for me, the flow part is like, I'm not making decisions anymore. I'm just doing the work that you let your brain gets to be on autopilot a little bit in that part of the process.
It does. So it's between an alpha and theta state. So the beta state is the struggle where you're overthinking. You're like, I don't know. And there's all this chatter, right? Then once you have these clear goals, this is flow 101, and you have the parameters. Okay, I've decided on the medium. I've decided on the style. I've decided on these elements that the client wants or that I want for this purpose, right? What's the purpose and function of this? Whether it's just to have fun and see how it goes, or it's a specific project, then you have the release where all of those decisions and parameters are clear. So you can relax into the flow part. That's what you said, the fun part.
Yes.
So for people listening, that is a very important part of flow is the clarity of your goals. If you don't have those, you will sit in the decision fatigue. I think you said option overload. That's a very good way to put it. And you won't progress. So just keep that in mind, those people listening. Now you described flow. Let's talk about recovery. What does recovery look like? Do you come out of flow and you're like, whoa, like I got to rest, I forgot to eat, things like this?
I'm trying to think what I traditionally do after in the recovery. Probably eat a snack, take a nap. I do a lot of walking. I always like let my exercise slip, and so like walking is a good way for me to kind of like process anything in a very passive way. And that's like an upside of a rural area is I have like tons of like beautiful scenery here, a lot of animals to look at, and so that's probably one of my number one ways of just like coming out and leveling out is a long walk.
That's awesome. So what the word you used was passive, which is excellent because it's really important to let your brain take a rest chemically as well. You've just exerted all these chemicals that help you focus when you're in flow, and they are very powerful. Some of them are like 10 times, 100 times more potent than medical morphine. This is like science we have right now. So it's no joke too that it can be addictive. Like when you do all-nighters, when we actually went to the same art school for those listening, and we had a lot of the same influences as far as instructors and professors and the environment. We were just overlapping for a short time. But when you pull all-nighters in art school, you come out understanding what that fatigue actually feels like and that you do not want that. that is unsustainable. So you learn what works for you. And the thing about flow is that it's different for every single person. And what works for you, what gets you into flow and excites you, and that spark that causes the release is very different for every single person. So let's talk about recovery. You went to Italy recently as well.
Yes.
For part of your sabbatical. Tell me about that.
So I went on a trip called Tipo Italia, and so it was it's a letterpress and type-based study in the Treviso area, so like a little north of Venice. And I'd been to Italy in the past. I think this was trip number 4 for me. I'd went in art school to study art history. But I was never able to make it up to Tipoteca, which is a letterpress and type museum there. And so during this trip, it was very much based in the museum. and we learned about letter forms kind of through that lens. And to me, it was a total dream. I wouldn't say it's the equivalent of Hatch. I feel like they operate in very different models. But as far as like the prestige, like if you're wanting to check out letterpress in Italy, go to Tipoteca. And so, I mean, because like the Roman letter as we know it, like came from Rome. Of course, there's going to be like a long tradition of beautiful letter forms. And so just getting to compare the type there and just kind of the tradition and how letters look out in the world. We took walking tours in Venice to just see how type is used in signage. We met with a sign painter. And again, it's like these cultural inputs that give you a perspective on stuff back home, and just comparing that and thinking like, wow, how can I integrate some of these like really beautiful design sensibilities? How can I interact with this language? How can I get better at this language so I can communicate with the older printers? That was one fun challenge at Tupoteca. Is I feel like every print shop has like a veteran printer that's been there forever. And so at this shop, like Daniele was the name of the printer there, and like we couldn't communicate super well verbally, but like we were on the same page process wise. He helped me out a lot in my projects. But as always, like interacting with the people and getting their perspective on the type and tools also just kind of impacts how I'm processing it as well.
That's awesome. So it's the, well, community, which brings us back to the beginning, right? And this human aspect. For you, it's part of your recovery is to put down your own work, but to intake other people's culture, work, the roots of something, and not necessarily be strategizing, you know, like thinking about the next thing, but more of just like, let me fully embrace what this is right now with these people in this environment. Would you say that's true?
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. The brain wants to try to like plan and be like the next thing, but being in the present is also part of flow. So I'm really glad you were able to do that and take the time after many years. How long had it been since you had that much time off, let's say?
A very long time.
Oh.
Yes, I think I would always get jealous of the interns at Hatch, because most of them were in like a transitory phase. Like I went straight from college, maybe had a month or two off, and then went straight into working full time. And so a lot of our interns would be in that in between time where they could take a couple months and intern in places and try new stuff out. And I was always thinking like, I wish I could do that, but I don't have the vacation time to do that. And so because I'm in this gap, I just really milked it and hoped that all the people I was currently working for would be okay with it and all my part-time jobs. But it was totally worth it. And I think like what I'm bringing back out of this particular summer's travels will only feed into what I'm doing going forward.
So the next thing I want to talk about briefly is understanding your own routines and how those fit into the sustainability of being an artist. And in particular, artists usually will have to work multiple gigs, right? So tell me a little bit about that, juggling that, because I remember lots of periods where you were gigging at night, working at Hatch during the day, driving back home, doing art center stuff, and also maintaining a relationship, which it's just kind of, and in maintaining the vision of your own work where you knew one day you would be here with your own studio.
Yeah, I think it's the same. I mean, it's still all those things. I feel I've definitely I'm gigging less in the musical realm just because I'm now an hour outside of Nashville. When I was living on the east side, it was so easy to say yes to a gig that was right down the road. And so you could play every night of the week if you wanted to. But now I've like pared that back a little bit just because I've taken on so many things in the art world. I feel like where I've slacked off doing a little less music, I have started doing more at the art center with just like community art and some of that programming and figuring out how that works. And I feel like I'm very bad at having like just open time. It's hard for me to just like sit down and have open time. And I don't know, it's like that part of my personality where I feel most fulfilled when I'm always doing stuff and I have to learn when to not do stuff. But I think since I've started doing more of my own work, I have had to be really good about scheduling more. Like nobody wants to like schedule and make a plan, but I do have to do that to make sure everybody is getting what they need. And so learning to prioritize things that absolutely must be turned in, but also like leaving some time to chill out, even if it's just like a little treat in between the projects. I have been trying to improve on that.
Awesome. It's knowing yourself, but also the feedback of like having those periods where you just went crazy, like, okay, let's do it, you know? So what I like about this, and there's many artists who can be hesitant about that in the moment. And yes, you have to know yourself, but when you go full throttle and you have that full experience, there's not really like what ifs as much. It's more of like, well, I did the thing. I went and I really did it and I'm good. And now I can step back, and because that experience was so rich and full. And that says something to like your commitment. So during that period, you're like, all right, I'm going to do the thing. It's going to be rough scheduling wise. Yes, I'll be tired. But the opportunity to play on with some of the people that you have played with in those night gigs and in certain venues in Nashville, those are never going to go away. Like those are memories that you have forever. And so I'm bringing this up because being an artist and a creative person is always about taking risks. You're constantly saying, okay, I'm going to jump, right? I don't know what's going to happen. And that part, when I describe what it's like to be an artist or a musician or a creative person living this type of life, I don't know other people who would constantly put themselves out there like that and into the unknown so many times, right? So I feel like artists really need a little more credit, you know, especially when people, I know you've heard this, like, well, I could make that. And in your mind, you're like, no, you really couldn't. Tell me your like ideas about this.
Yeah, like hearing that last sentiment. I think about it a lot at the art center because just think our art center is in like a pretty rural community. So I would say they're most well known for their theater program. You have a lot of locals. We're located on a highway, so we get a lot of traffic from the neighboring towns that come to see theater shows. So I would say your typical visitor, a lot of times, not an art person. And I help manage the gift shop there. And so it's like, you know, some people are going to understand the value in this. Some people are going to wonder, why does this cost, you know, a few $100s when I could make that, you know? And so I think I've just like learned to accept like not all art is going to be for every consumer. And so I try to be really good about curating the gift shop to include like, yes, you can have this $10 print, or you can have this original work for a few $100s, and finding out like the demographic and, you know, what's going to have a little something for everyone. Because on the flip side, like while we do have a lot of local visitors, you just never know who's coming down the highway. So we've had people walk in that have never been to Cannon County and buy something out of our gallery, like a high dollar piece out of the gallery. And so it's kind of just, again, a perspective thing, interacting with the scope of people that visit us. And it's just like, how are they, because you could not get a more true cross section of different people. I feel like when working at Hatch Show Print downtown, that's another like totally different kind of person. Hatch has a gallery too. And just seeing like what people like and what they value, it's going to be different for every person. And I think just accepting like you're not going to please every one of those people. And if you're okay with that, you're going to be so much happier as an artist, you know?
That is a great perspective. It's like a peaceful acceptance, right? And then inside of yourself, you're deciding, well, this is what I really want to do. So I'm just going to do it anyway. And I can't be worried about this, the acceptance, right? Because it's for me first.
Yeah. And I would say, like, with our gallery shows, we have probably 10 to 14 different gallery shows. We have 2 galleries at the Art Center a year, and almost every one of those shows will sell at least a piece. And it's kind of amazing, like, considering, you know, how relatively few people cycle through. In the scheme of things, it's not like we're a downtown gallery, but we still get like a ton of eyes on the work, and people are looking and people are valuing your work, whether you realize it or not.
That's awesome. That's a great reminder, because we can sit in our bedroom or, in our head and be like, no one's going to buy this. But the truth is, we don't know that. We absolutely do not know that. And so it's a great reminder. So I have a couple more questions. One of them is, well, first I'll say, recently, Heather had a design that she created for a US Postal Stamp. Tell me a little bit about, like, just the whole, was it surprising? Was it like exciting? And were you scared, or you were like, I got this? Like, what's it like to see your artwork on a stamp?
All of those things. It's good. I felt very fortunate whenever I heard from the Postal Service. I worked with an art director, Antonia Alcala, and he kind of guided me through the process. And it's such a long process. Like I said, sometimes at Hatch, you have a very short turnaround time on those posters. And this was more like a couple years in the making. So I spent a lot of the first part of the process, like making sketches and signing it off to committees for approval and hearing that feedback and regurgitating. So the whole time I've really just been emailing in this tiny bubble of humans I don't see in real life. And it almost feels like this can't be real. Like, you know, even for a year and a half, this can't be real, until I finally got to hold one in my hands and see other people getting it around. Like, people from around the country were sending me their stamps, and then it was really starting to set in that this was an actual project that happened. I'm certainly not used to working on that scale. I feel like my bread and butter is local bands. Like, I love connecting with the people in person and working on something that represents them. And so working on something on this scale, I really had to consider, like, who's going to see this? How can I make these people proud? Like, the stamp was based on bluegrass. And so, of course, I have a lot of ties to friends here in the local community that play that music. And so I was thinking about them. I was thinking about, you know, a lot of the bluegrass musicians that I admire and have admired. And it does feel like a lot of weight to make something on that scale versus, you know, working in ephemera and posters. Like, in theory, you're that show happens one night and it's over, and this poster becomes like a souvenir, and the stamp is literally a forever stamp. And so the pressure level did feel different, but it was just like, it was so nice to see it out in the community and in the hands of friends. And we did, when you release a stamp, you have a first day ceremony. And so this was the first time I really got to talk to people and see the stamp out in the real world. The official first day ceremony was in Owensboro, Kentucky, at the Bluegrass Museum there. And it was just like wonderful to see these people with a reverence for bluegrass, you know, getting to see the stamp. And we did another release event in my hometown, and it was kind of along those same ideas of, like, people need to see that this came from this tiny place and that we can still do these sorts of projects. So it was doubly fun to get to have those 2 events to acknowledge it was coming out. I really wanted it to be a community win, not just like my stamp that is out in the world. And so it was really fun. We had some local musicians out for that, and we got to celebrate it in that way.
That is awesome. I bought my whole sheet the day they came out and sent you a picture because I was just so happy. And What you just described, though, is something that I want listeners to remember. You can feel, especially when you are developing your skill and learning your process and understanding what flow is to you, like, this is my life. I am an artist. I am a musician. There's no like, I'm trying to be. I've decided this is it. And I don't care what anyone else says. I don't care. I don't have time to care because how I want to spend my time is doing the thing. And so we can forget that and be worried about the external in the world pushing us down, or haters and trolls and things that don't deserve our attention, because the joy that we're feeling as we're doing it is going to emit, emanate out in whatever we decide to share with the world. And we don't have to share everything. It can just be ours, right? But it's so easy to forget that you are important in what you're creating, whether it's like just your mom sees it, like it, and that's how a lot of artists started out, right? You show your mom, and they're like, "It's great, honey," you know.
Yeah.
And then you grow up and you see, and maybe there's exposure, and they're just feeling like, oh, I could never be that or whatever. But you can actually, and you can come from a tiny, tiny rural town and become the artist that you've always wanted to be. People can be the stamp on their letter that you made, but you know complexity of how that was created. As you said, you were thinking about your friends who played bluegrass. You were thinking about probably growing up, hearing those songs, understanding what those lyrics were about, the landscapes and the environment of living in a rural area. And to have it become and actually out in the world is really special, because it's about the connection that everyone who knows what bluegrass is understands when they see that stamp. So I just want to remind our listeners that, you are valuable, and you don't, need to lessen yourself in any way. Be unapologetically authentic and the rest will unfold. And I know it seems like a freaking roller coaster. But yeah, tell me any last, reflections that you have. Are
No,
welcome.
say about this whole episode. Is that what we're talking?
Yeah.
I really appreciate just kind of hearing your science behind some of the things that I've been feeling, because you forget that this experience is like shared, and the way that people kind of approach the artistic process is there's similarities and there's ways we can think about it. And I've really enjoyed like kind of hearing your interpretations of, oh yeah, this happens to everyone. This is like a pattern. So thanks for that. I was not realizing how much I could process through your feedback.
Oh, you're welcome. We've had some really fun times just, here at the end. I remember a story. So I was moving to Austin from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and Heather agreed somehow to drive with me in a
I got to go to a
U-Haul.
new place. I always want to go to a new place. That's how you do it.
And it was crazy because it was right after one of our rock camp showcases, which is like a very draining experience in the way of like gear and excitement and production and all of those things. It's really fulfilling, but also like physically tiring. But we got up the next morning and drove to Austin, Texas. But what was really fun was that I had this really old Casio keyboard. And Heather was in the passenger seat, and we just sang and played and covered all these songs in like the wackiest way. But we both love harmony as well, so it was like really fun to just play with that. And what I mean by like flow and thinking about that time, like I can reference it pretty directly the feeling that I had. I have no idea like what we really sang, but the feeling of it is so memorable because there wasn't like this element of we're performing for other people. We're just chilling and like
If there's not a moment that's totally for yourself, that was for us. No.
it was just like whatever. And that's the beauty of letting go of the expectation and playing, like really having fun with yourself. So if you're out there listening and maybe that's something you haven't allowed yourself to do that alone or find someone who is willing to just be really crazy with you and have fun, because I guarantee you will remember those moments more than the perfection that you did for a job. You'll remember those more in your life. So I want to thank you for that. And I have so many stories like that, which is really fun for me. It's been a pleasure having you on Flow Dive, and maybe we'll check in with you in a couple of years and see where you are and have you back on the show.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, everyone.